Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am BorderWise and welcome to From the Depths CRAM Overhaul Ideas by me, your host, BorderWise. And to start off with, we're gonna have a bit of an opening disclaimer. This video is being made because I mentioned the concept of putting out a video on my thoughts on how to improve CRAM cannons in From the Depths on stream one time. And people immediately were quite enthusiastically saying, yeah, do it, follow through on it, make the video. So that's the only real reason this video is being made, and why I'm putting my opinion out there is because people actually wanted it. So, just so you know. And the following part of the disclaimer is I do not claim to be an expert at From the Depths. I have 3,000 hours in it. I'm perhaps better than average. But I am not putting this video out there to wave a flag around and say, like, I know this game better than anyone else. I don't. There's a lot to know in From the Depths, and if you have to wait until you are the best at the game in order to have an opinion on it, you are gonna be waiting for a very, very long time. So, we're chucking this out there now, and the ideas for the CRAM overhaul is just coming from the fact that I like CRAMs, I play around with CRAMs a lot, and I would like to see them be as generally useful as the other weapon systems in From the Depths. So, basically what we're talking about here is not the fact that CRAMs are underpowered, so to speak. The main issue with CRAMs is their lack of versatility, and what I mean by that is that every other weapon system in From the Depths, if we're talking just categories, by the way, rather than individual components, is usable throughout the entire game. And mainly, what I'm using as, I guess, evidence to say this is things like just getting through the Niter campaign, the main campaign of the game, and also things like Ashes and Galau and stuff like that, but also tournaments. Like, tournaments are a bit of a sticky thing for balance. They're simultaneously really good for check and balance because it's like, you know, the restrictions are whatever the tournament organizer is putting in place. But yeah, so like, just within a rule set, it's a good balance model. So it's keeping that in mind of the tournaments I've seen. And so just going through the versatility of all the weapons categories, and I've made a tier list the other day about the From the Depths weapon system. Again, just based on my opinion and my experience with the game, and also, like, you know, a little bit of viewer feedback on like what they reckon was good and bad, or more good, less good. And like, I did completely forget about drills because they're that bad. But anyway, so versatility-wise, you've got simple weapons. They are simple, and they are easy to use. They're very volume efficient. The custom shell simple weapons are basically just compact APS, so that means they are exactly as good as whatever shell you jam into them. And then you have certain kind of combinations like rams and spin blocks can be absolutely devastating. The nuclear warhead can be super fun and super effective if you make the right suicide vehicle for it. Simple lasers, great close-in weapon defense, just so on and so forth. They're pretty versatile and they're pretty accessible. Then you have missiles. You have a variety of sizes for every occasion, from small to medium to large to huge, and you can use them in pretty much every imaginable capacity against any kind of target, whether the thing is on the surface, whether it's flying through the air, whether it's underwater via torpedoes, whether it's in space. Like, if you want to test if your space bomber is actually doing a good job evading stuff, spawn in the Steel Strider Spectre, because it's got actually pretty decent missiles. Or the Bull Shark. Jeez, that thing can ruin your space day if you haven't maxed out your missile defense. And then there's APS, and APS, Advanced Cannons, of course, they're the most versatile thing in the entire game. They're good for basically everything, provided you figure out how to prepare them for everything. There's a shell for every occasion. Single APS systems can be rigged to be generalist anti-everything counters, especially super cavitation railguns, because if you just get an AP railgun, maybe it's a pen depth, maybe it's hollow point or something like that, just whatever. High speed shell, super cavitation base, and just good rig, combine that with a good detection system, you can play through the whole game like that. And the only reason that you perhaps wouldn't see them more often in tournaments, especially, is because railguns are very expensive. But they pay for themselves very, very quickly. They absolutely disintegrate pretty much anything you care to name, like in no time flat. So they're super viable, and well, you have very little excuse not to use them, except if you don't want to. And then onto the energy weapons. Lasers are super versatile because really they're only truly bad against underwater targets. Anything above water, like even if they have smoke or shields, which are only really useful since they lower, and I was recently reminded of this the other day, anything that doesn't have good armor in the first place still gets melted by lasers, even with shields or smoke. So anything above water is fair game, especially smaller craft, especially things that are usually, you know, good at dodging stuff. It's just lasers just disintegrate them. Super viable, super versatile as long as you're not hiding underwater, and depending on how far underwater you're hiding, even then they can still work at the very least. And as for particle cannons, their whole job is to be like endgame anti-everything, so to speak. They don't have any form of hard counter, except perhaps clever armor schemes. Well, soft counters are clever armor schemes, which is just essentially block spam, and against impact particle cannons is just clever armor spacing. And range and firing angle, so like the attenuation of particle cannons, and the fact that they get less accurate long ranges, that's the only real counter against them. So otherwise, they're super versatile. So yeah, simple weapons of missiles, APS lasers, and particle cannons, they're all versatile, is the point I'm trying to make. They all have more than one function. You can have them as primary weapons, well, maybe not simple weapons, unless you're making very small craft. You know, you can use them as secondary weapons. All of them can be used as secondary weapons. You can use them against big and small things. You can use them against fast things. You can use them against slow things, underwater things, above water things, things in space, things at short range, things at long range. Just you can use them against a variety of stuff. Now, CRAM cannons, my baby, the thing that I love so much, favorite weapon type still. In contrast, they're specialized, like to a crippling degree. They are really only good against things that are any combination of the following: large, slow, above surface targets at short, maybe medium range that move in predictable straight lines that have insufficient lambs, seawers, or missile interceptors to shoot the shells down. That's pretty much the only thing they are generally good at shooting at. And the list of craft that fit the above description, if you're taking, like, in the Nita campaign, and especially in Glau and Ashes of the Empire, is just basically the few easier vehicles, mostly in the Deepwater Guard and the Onyx Watch, with every other faction on difficulties regular and higher, having either passive or active defenses that render CRAMs way less useful than any other weapon type. Like past the Onyx Watch, if you try to use mainly CRAM cannons, especially on higher difficulties, you are gonna have a rough time of it. It's not impossible, of course, like the skill ceiling for From the Depths is very high. There are people who can make it work, but I would guess that they'd have to use very clever craft design and even a fair amount of exploits in order to, you know, make that work. And, yeah, they'd have an easier time if they use something else. And furthermore, there is nothing that CRAM cannons can do in terms of raw damage, volume efficiency, or material efficiency that is not, in practice, done better by other weapon categories. So if you just look at the numbers, CRAM is very good in terms of, you know, raw damage, volume efficiency, material efficiency. Like, it looks really good, and it is kind of good, but in practice, everything else still does better. Like, raw damage, missiles do better, and they don't miss as much as CRAM shells do. Volume efficiency, again, CRAMs miss a lot. And material efficiency, CRAMs do add up in terms of expense, and they have a low fire rate, and again, they miss a lot. a equally sized CRAM cannon in APS, in terms of numbers, the CRAM cannon is more volume efficient in terms of damage and cost. In practice, that advanced cannon is effective against a much wider array of targets, and is more likely to actually hit the thing it's shooting at, just because the shells are a lot faster, and they can be made more accurate, and you can use funky things like heat and hash and hollow point and all that stuff that you can't do with CRAM cannons. So, yeah, CRAMs severely lack in terms of efficiency, so in any kind of context that does not favor them, they do not do well, and especially in tournaments, CRAM cannons tend to get used either because the rule set is actually rigged to favor them, or there is a strict cost limit, in which case their damage per volume and damage per material efficiency starts to come into play. If there's kind of no holds barred, you will not actually see them, and they will get outperformed by a lot of other stuff. Okay, so now that's the background of the thing as to why I reckon CRAMs could do with a bit of a tweak. For a start, a few tweaks can be made to CRAMs to make them slightly more effective and efficient, and it's just two things. It's just a tweak to numbers. So, for a start, max armor penetration could be raised to 60, and this would allow pure AP CRAMs to do full damage to heavy armor, because as of right now, pure kinetic CRAMs that just use hardened pellets and no other kind, they don't really have any form of niche. There's not really much they're good for, except possibly as use of distraction. Like, you can set up a CRAM cannon, like a multi-turreted CRAM, not multi-turreted, a multi-barrel CRAM turret, with one of the guns fires a pure AP shell, and the other guns on it fire, regular shells, HE, AP HE, frag, EMP, whatever you like. But they have flash suppressors on them, so that any anti-munition defenses shoot at the AP CRAM first, and that has a lot more health. As of the last CRAM update, it genuinely does have more health. And that's a way to use pure AP CRAMs. That's very niche, and it is immediately rendered useless if the enemy is using, timed flex CWIS, which will destroy your other CRAM shells anyway, or missile interceptors, which do area damage. So that is a very niche use for CRAMs, and it's only good against LAMs. It's not good against anything else. And so yeah, max AP I reckon could be raised, and single blocks that are multiple barrel lengths, so could be added in a similar line to advanced cannons, which have multiple barrel lengths, like 1, 2, 3, 4 meter variants of the barrels. And what this means is that it lowers the block count of your CRAM system, makes it quicker and easier to make long CRAM barrels, and because a longer barrel has more health, or a longer barrel segment has more health, it means they don't get snubbed quite as easily, so they don't get, cut off and rendering your CRAM really inaccurate. Okay, so what I've just said and the following changes, following suggestions for changes with new blocks and new UI accessed options, they're intended to make CRAMs more versatile and elevate them meta-wise to a similar level as other weapons, while retaining their primary niche as slow-firing megaguns. I am not in favor of making CRAM cannons just, APS done via a different way. Their slow fire rate and high damage per shot is their main appeal for me, and I feel a lot of people, and we want to retain that. So their niche, so to speak, both balance-wise and mechanics-wise, could be somewhat in between advanced cannons and missiles, with some forms of guidance, not as much as missiles, and the focus on high damage numbers, that being in common with missiles, and similar shell mechanics to APS, like, the turret has to track and aim and fire, bang, and, so yeah. And another big disclaimer is all numbers and formula that I'm about to suggest are initial suggestions only. And if any modder decides to try and make changes like this, or if the devs, in the highly unlikely event they want to, test this out for themselves, I believe they have tested stuff like this already, but I'm not sure. They're initial suggestions only, all numbers and formulae, initial suggestions only, and testing will be necessary to determine any potential balance issues, because I can't code for crap, and I can't test this kind of stuff myself, so apologies for that. But moving on to the actual major new suggestions. So, first thing we're going to go over is the new UI options. And so, the thought is these options will be accessed via the CRAM UI, and will change the properties of the shell being fired. So it's a little bit like particle cannons. You just go in there, you mess with the menu a bit, and you can select various options and change the properties of the shell. And to start off with, 3 different shell types for CRAM cannons, and the first one is the default one. It's the armor-piercing shell head that just inflicts basic kinetic damage. And like I said earlier, this is the shell that has potential for the max AP of 60, which is ideal for ideal for kinetic crams, and particularly any kind of AP cram cannon. So like, old-style battleship-style armor-piercing shell with a little bit of a payload, crash into thing, penetrate into it, it goes kablooey in the guts. And then there's the two new shell types is the crosshatch shell head. So the idea behind this one is basically a dum-dum round, like a dum-dum bullet, except it's a giant-ass shell. And no real-life equivalent for something this big, but it inflicts thump damage instead of kinetic, and it is limited to a max of 30 armor penetration, because we don't want the kind of thing where you could just have a pure AP cram that just melts entire ships with one shot. That would be a bit of a balance problem. And this would be ideal for crams that don't actually rely on kinetic damage for penetration, so pure HE, frag, EMP, or something like that, because usually, if you have a pure chemical cram shell, be it high explosive or anything else, it actually has a lot of kinetic damage, so because it's a big shell. Lousy armor piercing, the default armor piercing is just 0.1 unless you chuck some hardener pellets in there. But that's essentially wasted. It really doesn't do much. It damages maybe one block and that's it. And just, if you're not going to have the shell penetrate anything, just a crosshatch shell head would be more useful and viable. It means that damage can propagate a little better, and it means that it just, it's just the shell is overall more useful. And then the last new shell head is the disruptor head, and it's similar to the advanced cannon disruptor shell head, and this shell head just drastically changes the nature of the shell. So the max IP is reduced to 15, it reduces the max shell health by 50%, and doubles the detection distance for enemy munition warners, but it also greatly increases the max packing capacity. So you're trading armor penetration, shell health, and I guess shell stealth, I guess you could call it. It's a weird concept, but yeah, shell stealth. But you're increasing the packing capacity, and the reason the packing capacity gets increased is because this is the kind of thing you pretty much always want to use with a little bit of EMP, because it will use any EMP packing to penetrate and weaken any shields it passes through, exactly the same way as an advanced cannon disruptor shell would. And the reason for this is that at one stage in From the Depths development, cram cannons were essentially the anti-shield gun type, because reflector shields from shield projectors were more effective against fast shells rather than slow shells, which was a weird concept, but it actually worked kind of well. They changed that, so it's not so much the case anymore, but it was a badly needed niche for cram cannons that they have since lost, and it's kind of a soft nerf against them when that was changed. So this is kind of bringing back the idea that cram cannons can be used as shield busters, because you can have a whopping big EMP charge on them, and against anything that they can hit that happens to have strong shields, they can just whistle these disruptor heads through, and it means they're actually useful, and it means that if you want to weaken enemy shields, you don't have to use APS if for some reason you don't want to or aren't able to, within a rule set, for instance. Okay, so that's the 3 new shell heads that I've dreamt up. And now, you get to the part of the menu where there's just a bunch of ways to modify your shell. Just add bits that increase the utility of cram cannons. Not necessarily making them stronger, but just basically broadening the number of situations in which a cram cannon could be useful. And the first one of which is the HE formula modifier. So, it's basically just a slider, very similar to what you see in the particle cannon UI. It just sets the exact ratio between the damage of a high explosive cram shell and its radius. Which basically means that you can have, explosive cram shells sacrifice damage for greater area of effect, and vice versa. And this is still subject to the max HE radius, which means that this slider is less useful at high packing and at high gauges. It's more useful for a smaller cram cannon to get as big an area effect as possible. And you require, of course, high explosive or uranium pellets in order for this formula to do anything, and more on uranium pellets later. And then the next is stabilizing fins. And this greatly increases the max accuracy of the shell at the expense of the maximum packing rate. So it's basically a trade-off between, okay, the thing doesn't do as much damage, but it's way more accurate, and also useful for if you don't want, a giant noodle barrel, for instance. You don't want a whole bunch of regular cram barrels that are extra weight, extra expense, and stuff like that. And this is required for the remote guidance system to work, which I'm going to cover right now, actually. So, extra thing, remote guidance system. And this requires stabilizing fins, as I've just said, and it comes at the expense of maximum packing again. So, again, you're trading maximum damage for more utility. And this makes the shell work in a similar manner to a remote guided missile, using the mothercraft's detection information to steer the shell towards the target, and this requires a general-purpose processing power, but less than an equivalently sized missile. So there's kind of your niche for this kind of thing, is like, alright, so the thing's got decoys up the wazoo, and it's like, it's like maybe too tough for, any kind of smaller APS system you have, but you can guide a cram shell right on top of it, and that is great fun. And the suggested steering power, again, this is just a suggestion. This would require actual in-game testing to see what is balanced and what isn't, is about 2 degrees per second, which means that over about 10 seconds of flight time, the shell can correct its course by about 20 degrees. Which can mean the difference between it missing by inches and it actually landing on target. And crams often, I tend to find in my combat testing with them, is that they do whiff by inches, and it's almost worse than if they miss by a mile, because it's just, they whiff by just a few meters, or just under or overshoot by just a little bit, and it drives me crazy. So this is a system to basically compensate for that. You're still not going to be able to, shoot down a jet fighter that's moving at 100 meters per second and is just bouncing up and down and stuff like that. So it's not going to do a better job against erratic targets than a laser or APS or particle cannons or missiles or anything like that. So that niche is preserved. And because it's 2 degrees per second, it means that slower shells have more time to steer themselves on target. So this is an incentive to keep your cram shells a little bit slow, not to go full hog with all the other things I'm about to suggest that makes them go faster, because oh boy, there are ways to make them go faster, don't you worry. And but before we get to that, we can talk about the magnets. So this works almost identically to missile magnets, so like the magnet bombs that are a staple of missiles. And it works the same way. It draws the shell towards a craft within magnetic range. Magnets have a default 5-second activation delay that you can change, and it's most useful when the shell loses all its velocity as the magnet stops fighting the shell's forward momentum. And it is much more powerful and has a much more pronounced effect with smaller shells. So, again, this is a way of incentivizing players to use smaller gauge crams, rather than just always going with as big as possible, because, The 1000mm guns need some love too. And this kind of magnet, I would imagine, would allow CRAM depth charges and anti-submarine use to be more feasible. And it comes at the cost of maximum packing because, you know, you've got to stick a magnet in the shell. And similar to, on a similar note to this kind of thing, is the flotation chamber. So this works similar to missile ballast tanks, and it allows CRAM shells to have positive, negative, or neutral buoyancy at the cost of max health. So basically, you're compromising the metal covering on the shell in order to make it lighter. And you combine this with magnets, remote guidance systems, and/or supercav barrels, more on them later. This allows CRAMs to function as dumbfire or semi-guided torpedoes. So they're not going to supplant missile torpedoes or supercavitation APS, but it's something that allows CRAMs to potentially be used in a beneath-surface fashion, because currently they're completely useless in that regard for the most part. You need to get really close, or you need to do other funky stuff in order to use CRAMs against submarines, or even like ships that are mostly under the water. Okay, so moving on. Cluster splitter. When this component is added, the CRAM will split into smaller CRAM shells upon impact, being destroyed by anti-munition systems. Well, it's upon impact, upon being destroyed by anti-munition systems, or through being triggered with a timed fuse. Or I guess an inertial fuse. So this is actually something that the devs are planning on adding anyway, but it's such a fun idea that I have to include it here. Anywho, and the subshells being spawned can be between 200 to 1000 millimeters, between 10 to 2 submunitions, and each of them inheriting an equal percentage of the parent shell's health and damage. So, yeah, so this is essentially the way to bring back 200mm CRAM shells, because goodness knows they weren't useful back when they were a thing. And the subshells can be set to inherit all or none of the fuses and properties from their parent shell, except for timed or altitude fuses, because that would work a little bit weird, because the fuse is already triggered on the mother shell. And the angle that the subshells are ejected out at can be set between 10 and 180 degrees, so a little bit like how fragments are tweaked. So yeah, just cluster CRAM idea. This is mostly a fun thing. And like, it's like cluster missiles, like, they don't really have a niche of their own that I know of. You can just do funky and cool stuff with them. Speaking of funky cool stuff, we're getting to the first option for making your CRAM shells go faster, aside from painting them red. It is the gyrojet booster. So, for those of you who don't know, a gyrojet is a conceptual alternative to... Well, it is a conceptual... Well, no, it is an alternative way of, well, firing a gun. Instead of propelling your projectile with explosive propellant, like gunpowder, you instead fire a mini rocket. So, you know, it's just a tiny rocket and you pull the trigger and it goes whoosh, and you essentially fling a tiny rocket at people. In this case, a much bigger rocket. This greatly increases the material cost of the shell because, you know, rocket propellant isn't cheap, but it causes constant acceleration the longer the shell is in the air, up to 10 seconds. So when the shell is fired, it's going to keep increasing in velocity up to the 10-second mark, and then that's the max. So the max speed boost is 375 meters per second, and coupled with the new max shell velocity of 625 meters per second, more on that later, which means that if you combine a gyrojet booster with the options I'm going to mention in a minute, the max speed for a CRAM shell is 1000 meters per second. However, it does not reach max velocity immediately. It needs to be at a bit of a range for that. So the shell needs to still be in the air for about 10 seconds before it can hit that maximum possible speed limit of 1000 meters per second, because we don't want CRAMs being too fast too easily. And this does, just for balance purposes, this does not increase the kinetic damage or AP of the shell, but it does allow CRAMs to be more feasible at long range, and it adds a trail effect similar to missiles, and it has no effect underwater. So it's essentially turning the CRAM shell into, like, well, a rocket, so to speak, and you combine it with the stabilizing fins and remote guidance to basically improvise a remote-guided missile, except with not very good tracking, and just it functions a little bit differently, and thus does not actually supplant the role that they have. And yeah, can't fire this thing. The Gyrojet has no effect underwater because, well, rockets don't really work well underwater, do they? And moving on finally to the new blocks, of which there aren't too many, but new pellet types are among them. And the first one, and this is one I have seen multiple times be requested or suggested, and that's gunpowder pellets. So, in my brain, I would imagine these to be cheap, volatile pellets, because it is explosive propellant after all, that increases the speed of the shell fired. So it's like a regular pellet, but instead of adding higher damage numbers, it just adds more velocity. So yeah, so add small amount of muzzle velocity and can damage to the cram shell for every second of packing per packing connection. The amount of velocity added per second is greater for lower gauge cram. So once again, this is incentivized, like if you want really fast cram shells, you have an easier time of it at lower gauges rather than higher gauges. And it means there's actually a practical difference between using a lower gauge cram rather than a high gauge cram. And the formula, which I'm probably going to chuck on screen right now, as of right now, at its conceptual stage, is basically the muzzle velocity boost equals 1 times the number of connections times the pack-in time, all that times 1000 divided by the cram gauge, which means that it's times 1 if it's the minimum gauge of 1000 millimeters, and times 0.5 if it is the max gauge of 2000 millimeters. And that number all divided by the max packing capacity. I really hope I remember that formula well and actually read it out correctly. So, like I said before, the maximum speed boost for a cram shell, as in the added numbers, is 425 meters per second. For an overall max shell velocity, if you're not using a gyrojet with it, of 625 meters per second, which coincidentally is the same muzzle velocity as the Cold War prototype weapon, the US M65 atomic cannon, which I believe was fired only once or maybe twice. And it's just a handy number to stick with. It has a thematic appeal. And next on the list for things that you can implement into the game to boost the shell, you have an alternative, which is Gauss charges. So APS has railguns, which are honestly like the way they function is basically a Gauss gun. But for crams, you have Gauss charges. So they're similar to gunpowder pellets, and they still connect to packers. But they're non-volatile, and they're more expensive, ideally. And they draw on battery power to increase muzzle velocity, similar to an APS railgun. And they are twice as effective as gunpowder pellets. So the formula is a little different. So the muzzle velocity boost equals 2 times the number of connections times pack-in time. All that times 1000 divided by the cram gauge, all of that divided by the max packing capacity. So each connection drains 2 battery energy per second, same muzzle velocity boost limit of 425 meters per second, and the max muzzle velocity limit of 625 meters per second, which means that if you want fast shells, you're still generally better off with APS, and especially if you want fast shells fired very quickly. But if you want a big kaboom, yeah, cram is the way to go, because I mentioned uranium pellets earlier, and here they are. They are basically an alternative to HE pellets if you feel like going full crazy, because they're very expensive, they are incredibly volatile, and they are EMP susceptible, but they add huge amounts of HE damage to the shell at the cost of shell health and detection range. So basically they're easier for enemy munition warners to see, and they have less health. This is not, strictly speaking, in keeping in line with how nuclear explosives work in real life. This is mainly for balance purposes, because otherwise these things would be ridiculously overpowered. Yeah, and we don't want that. So, maximum reduction of health, well, the percentage of shell packing that is uranium explosive equals the shell health reduction. So if the packing is 90% or over, the shell's health is reduced by 90%, which basically means that these are things you have a better chance of shooting down. And just for giggles, it adds a nuclear explosion effect to the shell's detonation above 30,000 HE damage. So remember the M65 atomic cannon I mentioned earlier? Yeah, this is basically means to get something like that into the game for maximum funsies. And hopefully it won't be a balance issue. And last but not least is smoke pellets. So this behaves exactly the same as advanced cannon smoke warheads. It's just more packing and higher gauge results in a larger and denser smoke cloud, and also adds a teeny tiny amount of HE damage because, you know what, a smoke grenade still explodes and you don't want to be holding it when it explodes. And so this is basically a means of CRAM cannons that are faced with strong lambs. They can still kind of act on their own a little bit, and you don't automatically need to add a secondary advanced cannon that chucks smoke at the target, because, I don't know, there's nothing especially wrong with that, but it's just, it would be nice to have CRAM cannons act on their own, all grown up and big. Alright, so now we have new barrels, and first off there is just what I mentioned earlier, is 2 to 4 meter variants of regular, heavy, motorized, and elevation barrels, just to lower the block count and to make barrels a little bit more sturdy. And we have the other new barrel, which is the supercavitation barrel. So, this is basically the CRAM equivalent of supercavitation shells, but you're messing with the barrel, not the shell. So this can only be placed at the end of the CRAM barrel. And this projects an electrostatically held bubble around the shell it is fired, allowing it to ignore the slowdown effect of water, but only while the shell remains submerged. If the shell breaks the water's surface, the effect is lost. If the shell is fired above water, the effect does not trigger. And this allows below surface and submarine mounted CRAM cannons to be feasible. So you can basically stick a CRAM turret on the underside of your ship, and that can be essentially your depth charge launcher, or maybe dumbfire torpedo launcher. And it also means that if you, say, have CRAM barrels long enough to dip into the water, they can actually fire at submarines a bit. The fact that you have to place this at the end of the barrel also retains a little bit of balance, because it means that that gets blown off first. Okay, so moving along, that's basically it for my suggestions. So, again, more conclusion, well, not more conclusion, conclusion plus disclaimer. These changes will hopefully make CRAMs more versatile and fun to use, whereas preserving some of their inherent weaknesses against small and evasive targets. So they have, like missiles, they have some guidance, and they have some funky things like magnets and stuff like that. And like APS, they can use disruptors and thump damage and stuff like that. But they should not be able to beat missiles and APS at their own game. We don't want that. That's no fun. And they're still, because they're going to be what I'm picturing here is something that they still fire slowly. You're still much better off with a CRAM cannon that fires powerful shells at a slow rate, rather than trying to make the thing fire very quickly, and they're still not going to be, easy to shoot down small or highly evasive targets with them, because that is the niche covered by other weapon types. And so, to conclude this video, if the devs are watching or seeing this, firstly, hi, love your work. These are suggestions only. I'm not making any demands of you, and I fully acknowledge that this is bypassing the usual channels of suggestion and feedback, and thus do not expect any special consideration. And if anyone's wondering what those usual channels are, From the Depths has a Discord, an official FTD Discord, and I will post a link to that in the description. And also there is an official request tracker, which is where you usually go to suggest changes to the game, fun things to be added, fun things to be changed, and I will be posting a link to that as well. So, Thank you so much for watching this video and listen to me ramble on about my daydreams for how to make the CRAMs better. So thank you all so much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Support me on Patreon or YouTube membership if you like. It really helps, and there's fun perks in it for you. Thank you to all my current supporters, and I will see you next time in From the Depths. Farewell.